In 1631, a woman died on a battlefield. She was not a soldier. She was an empress, and her death would unleash a madness that would consume the most powerful empire in the world. 22,000 men would spend 22 years building her tomb. The treasury of a civilization would be emptied, and the emperor who ordered it all would die a prisoner, locked in a tower, staring at what his love had created. Most people think the Taj Mahal is a love story. They are wrong. It is a story of obsession, financial collapse, and the slow destruction of an empire that was never the same again. Her name was Arjumand Banu Begum. History knows her as Mumtaz Mahal, which translates as the chosen one of the palace. She was 19 years old when she first met the prince who would one day become Shah Jahan. He was 16, and from the moment he saw her in the bazaar of Agra, something inside him broke permanently. He could not eat. He could not sleep. He told his father, the Emperor Jahangir, that he would marry no one else. Not for political advantage, not for territorial alliance, not for any reason that an emperor's son was supposed to give when choosing a wife. He wanted her because he wanted her, and no argument from any advisor or minister in the empire was going to change that. They waited 5 years. 5 years of a prince tormented by a love he could not touch. When they finally married in 1612, the entire Mughal court understood one thing immediately. This was not a political alliance. This was something far more dangerous. Shah Jahan had other wives. He was required to, because politics demanded it. But Mumtaz was different in ways that were visible to anyone at court. She was always beside him, on military campaigns, in the war tent, across deserts and mountains and river crossings. She refused to stay behind in the palace like other empresses, and he refused to leave her, not because he needed her strategically, because he could not imagine being in a world where she was not also present. She bore him 14 children in 19 years of marriage. 14. That number alone tells you something about the nature of their relationship that no historian needs to interpret. She was almost continuously pregnant throughout their married life, traveling with him on campaigns, delivering children in the field, recovering, and pregnant again within months. And then, in the summer of 1631, during a military campaign in the Deccan region of southern India, she went into labor with their 14th child. The birth was difficult from the beginning. She had survived 13 previous births under conditions that would have broken lesser women. But this time, something went wrong in a way that the imperial physicians could not address. The labor lasted approximately 30 hours. Shah Jahan remained outside the tent for the entire duration. He paced. He prayed. He sent messengers inside every few hours to ask for reports that grew worse each time. She died on the 17th of June, 1631. The child survived. The empire did not. Not really. Not after that night. Witnesses described what happened to Shah Jahan in the hours after her death as something they had never seen in a man of his power. He collapsed. He wept for 8 days without stopping. He refused food. He refused water. He refused the entire apparatus of administration that required his attention every day to function. The Mughal governmental machine ground to a halt because the emperor could not stop crying. Governors sent dispatches requesting guidance on urgent matters. The dispatches piled up unanswered. Military decisions waited. The empire ran on momentum and the decisions of subordinates who were afraid to act without imperial sanction. When Shah Jahan finally emerged, his hair had turned white. He was 39 years old. The court was frightened, not of his grief, but of what his grief revealed. She had been holding something together in him, something essential, and without her, the architecture of the man himself was uncertain. And then Shah Jahan spoke. He said he would build her a tomb. Not a tomb in the ordinary sense. The tomb. A structure so perfect, so geometrically exact, so overwhelmingly beautiful, that the entire world would understand what he had lost simply by standing in its presence. His advisors nodded carefully. None of them understood yet what he actually meant. None of them understood the scale of what was about to begin. Shah Jahan gathered the greatest architects, engineers, calligraphers, and craftsmen from across the known world. Ustad Ahmad Lahori, widely believed to be the primary architect, came from Lahore. Master craftsmen arrived from Persia and the Ottoman Empire. Gem cutters traveled from Baghdad. Calligraphers arrived from Shiraz. Marble specialists were brought from Makrana in Rajasthan. The only quarry producing the specific grade of white marble Shah Jahan demanded. A marble so pure that light does not simply reflect from its surface, but penetrates into the stone and re-emerges, giving the structure an appearance of glowing from within. The site chosen was on the southern bank of the Yamuna River in Agra. Shah Jahan selected the location personally. From across the river, the tomb would reflect in the water. It would appear to float between the earth and the sky. He approved every detail himself, every proportion, every dimension, every inlay pattern. There are accounts of him reviewing architectural drawings in sessions that lasted through the night, dismissing proposals that were 99% correct because 100% was the only acceptable answer. The main dome rises to a height of 73 meters, roughly equivalent to a 24-story building. It was constructed without steel, without concrete, and without mechanized cranes of any kind. Every stone was lifted by human and animal labor, using ramps of compacted earth that required thousands of workers to build, maintain, and eventually tear down. Construction began in 1632, and almost immediately the problem started. The river was the first enemy. The Yamuna shifts course seasonally, flooding the floodplain with regularity and shifting its channel in ways that make long-term planning difficult. The foundations of a structure this massive needed to reach bedrock. But bedrock near the Yamuna was not a clean, solid layer accessible at a predictable depth. It was unstable, saturated with water, and treacherous in ways that became apparent only as excavation proceeded, and the soil began behaving in ways that the initial surveys had not captured. The engineers solved this with a technique that had no precedent in Mughal engineering. They sank thousands of individual wells into the ground, packed them with stone rubble and mortar, and created an artificial foundation platform of interconnected stone cylinders driven deep into the riverbank. Each cylinder bore a portion of the massive weight above it. The entire structure was floating on a forest of stone columns pressed into saturated soil. The approach was invented for this specific problem, on this specific site, for this specific structure. There was no manual to consult, no previous project to reference. They were solving an engineering problem that had never existed before, under pressure from an emperor who did not accept the word impossible. It worked. The Taj Mahal has not shifted measurably in nearly 400 years. But building that foundation killed men. Workers drowned in shifting soil as excavation walls gave way without warning. Others were crushed when timber shoring failed under the weight of waterlogged earth. In the first 2 years of construction, the foundations consumed more men than most of Shah Jahan's military engagements. The records do not tell us how many died. The Mughal court kept meticulous accounts of marble deliveries and payments to master craftsmen. It kept almost no records of common laborers. They were hired from the surrounding region and from further afield, fed and housed in the temporary city that grew up around the construction site, a city that at its peak held over 20,000 people and generated its own economy, its own hierarchy, and its own dead. When workers died, they were replaced. Their names are recorded nowhere. Their contributions are visible in every stone, and the cost was beginning to terrify even Shah Jahan's most loyal ministers. The Mughal Empire, in the 1630s, controlled approximately 1/4 of the entire world's economic output. The imperial treasury was staggering in its size, but the Taj Mahal was consuming it. Estimates suggest the total cost of the complex reached somewhere between 32 million and 100 million rupees in the currency of the era. In modern terms, historians estimate the cost at somewhere between $1 billion and $1 trillion. The range is that wide because the records are incomplete. What is not disputed is this: it was obscene. Over 1,000 elephants were engaged exclusively in transporting materials at the peak of construction. Each elephant required a trained handler, hundreds of kilograms of fodder daily, veterinary care, and replacement when injured. Managing 1,000 working elephants would have qualified as a major undertaking for most kingdoms of the era. For Shah Jahan, it was one line item. The semi-precious stones for the interior inlay work required a global supply chain. Jasper from Punjab, jade from China, turquoise from Tibet, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, sapphire from Sri Lanka, carnelian from Arabia. Each shipment crossing deserts, mountain passes, and sea routes to reach craftsmen who cut these stones to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter. A global supply chain for a tomb, for one woman, because one man could not accept her absence. Shah Jahan's ministers said nothing. The emperor's grief had transformed into something harder and colder. He was not weeping anymore. He was building. And anyone who suggested slowing down found themselves reassigned to a province very far from the imperial court. The Taj Mahal was completed in 1648, 17 years after Mumtaz died. Shah Jahan visited on the day of completion and walked through the complex for hours without speaking. He stood at the edge of the reflecting pool and looked at the dome above the water, perfectly reflected. The image so precise that visitors today cannot immediately determine which is the real structure and which is the reflection. And then he cried again. The building was perfect, and she was still gone. No amount of marble changes that. No perfection of proportion closes the space left by a specific person. He had spent 17 years in an empire's treasury discovering something that grief teaches every person eventually, but that most people do not have the resources to discover on this scale. The monument cannot replace the person. It can only describe the size of the absence. His 4 sons had been watching their father's reign from the positions of governors and military commanders to which they had been assigned, watching with very different emotions and drawing very different conclusions. The oldest, Darashikoh, was Shah Jahan's favorite, a philosopher and scholar who carried his father's aesthetic sensibilities and intellectual curiosity. The 3rd son, Aurangzeb, was something else entirely. Devout to the point of austerity, precise to the point of coldness, completely without sentimentality about anything that could not be measured or fortified. He had watched the treasury numbers across decades of his father's reign. He had watched the military failures in the Deccan and in Central Asia, campaigns that consumed armies and produced nothing decisive. He had watched his father spend on beauty while the administrative foundations of the empire developed quiet cracks that a less distracted ruler would have addressed years earlier. Aurangzeb did not weep at the beauty of the Taj Mahal. He looked at it and calculated what it had cost, and he concluded that the empire had paid a price for that beauty that it could not afford and would not recover from. He was not entirely wrong. In 1657, Shah Jahan fell seriously ill. His 4 sons went to war against each other across northern India. Armies moved. Brothers were killed or captured. Aurangzeb won. He marched on Agra and placed his own father under house arrest in the Agra fort. Shah Jahan was 66 years old. He would spend the last 8 years of his life confined to the Musamman Burj, a tower in the fort, cared for by his daughter Jahanara, who chose to remain with him rather than accept the freedom Aurangzeb offered. She could have left. She stayed. And in those 8 years, the two of them lived in a strange, compressed world of gardens and courtyards and long conversations that the historical record does not preserve in any detail. He had access to comfort that most prisoners in the 17th century could not have imagined. But the walls were still walls, and the guards were still guards, and the emperor, who had commanded the most powerful army in Asia, could not walk through a gate without permission from his own son. And from the window of his tower, across the Yamuna River, he could see the Taj Mahal. The tower is positioned at the northeastern corner of the Agra fort. From its windows, the Taj Mahal is clearly visible approximately 2 kilometers downstream. The white dome catches the morning light in a way that makes it appear to rise from the mist above the river. The view has not changed since Shah Jahan's time. Visitors to the fort today can stand at the same windows and look across the same river at the same dome. It is one of the most uncomfortable views in the world, if you know what you are looking at. He looked at it every day for 8 years. Aurangzeb expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent. On a map, the Mughal Empire under Aurangzeb was the largest it had ever been, stretching from Kabul in the northwest to the tip of the Deccan in the south, encompassing a territory larger than any Indian empire before or since. But it was hollowing from within. He banned music at court. He banned the figurative art that had been one of the greatest achievements of Mughal civilization. He reimposed discriminatory taxes that Akbar had abolished a century earlier, precisely because they generated resentment among the Hindu majority that the empire depended on for its administrative and military functioning. He fought continuous wars in the Deccan that drained the army and the treasury without achieving the lasting stability the region required. The wars of expansion that made the empire enormous on a map made it fragile in reality. Armies stretched across thousands of kilometers of difficult terrain cannot be resupplied efficiently. Governors at the edges of an empire this large develop their own interests, their own relationships, their own local loyalties that gradually replace the loyalty to a distant center. The center loses its grip not through sudden catastrophe, but through the slow erosion of control that distance and complexity produce over decades. When Aurangzeb died in 1707, he left behind an empire with no clear succession plan, a treasury depleted by 40 years of warfare, and administrative structures weakened by religious policies that had fractured the coalition of communities that Akbar had spent his life building. Within 30 years of his death, Mughal emperors had become ceremonial figures with no real power, maintained by regional strongmen who found it convenient to rule in the name of an emperor they did not obey. Within 50 years, the empire was fragmenting into successor states that competed with each other and with the new powers that sensed the weakness and moved toward it. By the time the British East India Company arrived with serious military force in the 1750s, there was not enough coherent Mughal authority left to mount effective resistance. The empire that had controlled 1/4 of the world's wealth was gone within a century of Aurangzeb's death. Shah Jahan died on the 22nd of January, 1666. He was 74 years old. He died in the tower, looking at the river. His body was carried across the Yamuna by night and interred in the chamber beneath the Great Dome. He had not planned to be buried inside the Taj Mahal at all. His original design, referenced in several historical accounts and debated by scholars ever since, was reportedly to build a second mausoleum for himself on the opposite bank of the Yamuna River. A twin structure in black marble, two monuments facing each other across the water for eternity. One white and one black, one containing her, one containing him, separated by the river and united by the reflection. The Black Taj. It was never built. We do not know with certainty whether it was ever truly planned. The evidence is fragmentary, the accounts are second and third hand, and serious scholars disagree sharply about whether the story is historical fact or a later romantic invention. But the story has persisted for more than 3 centuries. And stories that persist that long without documentary evidence persist because they capture something emotionally true, even when they are not literally accurate. Instead, his body was carried across the Yamuna by night and placed beside her. His tomb sits slightly off-center in the burial chamber, the only asymmetric element in an otherwise perfectly symmetrical structure, because the space beside Mumtaz was designed for her alone, and his presence there was the consequence of his son's decision, not his own. There is one final thing that almost no one discusses. Shah Jahan reportedly ordered, upon completion of the Taj Mahal, that the hands of the master craftsman be cut off, so that nothing like it could ever be built again, so that the Taj Mahal would remain for all time singular. This story is almost certainly a myth. There is no documentation to support it. Several craftsmen known to have worked on the Taj Mahal subsequently worked on other imperial projects, which would have been impossible if the story were true. But the legend has existed for nearly 400 years, and legends do not persist without reason. The reason this one persists is because it captures something true. It represents an act of creation so extreme, so total, so consuming, that it feels as though it should have destroyed something in the making. And it did. It destroyed the treasury. It destroyed years of political attention. It set in motion a chain of events that contributed to the end of the greatest empire Asia had seen in centuries. Not immediately, not through a single act, but through the slow accumulation of a grief that became an obsession that became a monument, and a monument whose shadow fell across everything that came after. The Taj Mahal is the most beautiful building in the world. Virtually everyone who has seen it in person agrees without reservation. 17 million visitors per year stand at the edge of that reflecting pool and feel something they cannot name. What they are feeling, whether they know it or not, is the weight of all of this. The 22,000 workers whose names are recorded nowhere. The treasury emptied across 2 decades. The emperor imprisoned in a tower with a view he could not look away from. The empire that collapsed slowly in the long shadow of a dome. The Taj Mahal is not a love story. It is a warning. The most beautiful warning ever built. It has been standing for nearly 400 years, unchanged, uncorrected, unrepentant, waiting for someone to read it correctly, and almost no one ever does.